Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of Transylvaniacs. I'm Colleen.
And I'm Will.
And this is episode 0 slash 0.5, I guess, of a podcast where two idiots try to watch as many Dracula adaptations as possible, which may not prove to be possible, but we'll do our best.
We're going to try our best to get from every adaptation from Dracula A to Dracula Z. I'm going to keep using that.
Thank you very much.
Tagline.
I think you should. I had on the notes here, I just have A to Z gag because it's too good to not. But before we kind of get into what we're doing today, which will be reviewing the source material before we start getting into adaptations, might as well introduce ourselves. Will, what's your deal? Who are you?
My name is Will. I am a photographer, writer, probably a third thing I'll add down the line, based out in Philadelphia.
Excellent. I'm Colleen. I am also a writer and artist, and technically speaking, I work in robotics, but that is only true in the most technical of senses. And I'm based in Pittsburgh. And yeah, we are two longtime friends. I think we're probably coming up on a decade, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because I think we met in 2011. Does that, or maybe 2012? Like somewhere around there. Because I remember, yeah.
We met around 2012. It was probably, it was during our class on documentaries.
Oh, God, yes. Okay. Yeah, so I had met Chris and my wife, Addie, in 2011 in a fiction writing class. And then I don't know if you were their roommate at the time, but you were definitely in their circle. And then Addie went to London for a semester. So in her absence, you, me, and Chris took documentary filmmaking. Yeah, you're totally right. That was 2012. That was such a shit show of a class. Holy cow.
Yeah. Fun fact, we were supposed to make a documentary at the end of the class, and I just made stuff up. Not in like a scandalous thing, like just fully made a mockumentary. Just pretended there was a society of ghost hunters on campus and just interviewed people about it. I still got full grades.
Love that.
System works.
I wound up with my nemesis, who shall not be named because I'm not looking to dox this woman. But like I should have just been like, I'll join your group. But for some bizarre reason, I wound up with two women, one of whom was like completely checked out, and the other who was like, I will do whatever I can to drive this project into the ground. So I definitely did a documentary film about the Native American reservation that was nearby without actually going to the Native American reservation. And also got rewarded for that. Turns out it's a lot harder than just like rolling the fuck up to the res. Like you gotta like get permits and stuff. And I was I don't know, 20. Like why was I gonna do that?
Hi, can we make a movie about you?
It's literally like an episode of Daria. It's embarrassing. But yeah. So the next thing I have on my list here is why are we doing this? LMAO.
Would you like to lead the charge?
I guess so. I feel like the two of us, first of all, have a bad case of can't shut the fuck up disease.
Yes.
Desperately bad. But I think this concept was birthed maybe last spring or prior to that, where we were just talking about our kind of rediscovering of classic literature, and also we've always, you in particular have a history of movie reviews, right?
Yes, I was for a number of years a critic for the site Rooster Illusion Reviews. I did 2 weekly columns.
Damn, that's pretty dope. I think specifically though, like this came across because we were watching the Netflix animated series Castlevania and talking about how good God, there are so many different adaptations of Dracula, and they all go in 1,000 directions, and some of them are much more straight up than other ones. And we just kind of came up with the idea on the spot of we should just get a list together to see how many we can watch.
Exactly, yes. I mean, I'm no stranger to this, to good old Vlad. I feel like I've seen my fair share of adaptations, read my fair share of adaptations, and I've still barely scratched the surface of how many are out there.
Yeah, no, there's so many. And in kind of preparing for this, we did a semi-extensive list, and we were like, oh God, if we actually go through with this, we're going to be doing this for fucking ever, which is hilarious. So I'm very excited to kind of start the charge with you here on this fine evening.
So I don't know if we had this the on your list here, but one thing I wanted to get was sort of what was your history with Dracula specifically, like the character? What was your, if you can even remember, what was your first introduction to the concept of Dracula?
Oh, to the concept of Dracula. That's such a good question. Probably, and this is such a bullshit answer, but like probably Sesame Street, probably The Count. Because I feel like that's where most kids are gonna, most kids who are our age, not like current children, are gonna see The Count on Sesame Street. In terms of the actual story of Dracula, not just the character, I think I probably sometime in middle school saw something around that. I'll get to that later when we get to like the actual text.
Mm-hmm.
But what about you? When did you first come across the undead man himself?
Oh, very good. I think obviously The Count was there, but my first realization is probably when I was 5 or 6, somewhere around there. I was one of those kids who was very into the Universal monsters, just as a concept.
Oh, this tracks.
Before I had seen a lot of them, just as icons, I thought they were really cool. And I think at some point around that same age, I saw there are always just movies playing in my house. My dad is a huge cinephile. He's always playing something. And there must have been at some point, I don't even remember what adaptation it had to be, but there was some old Dracula movie on, and it was a scene where Lucy is coming back from the dead and emerges from her coffin, and it just scared the shit out of me.
Oh my God, I love that so much.
And it was just burned in my brain for years. I want to say it was probably Horror of Dracula with Christopher Lee, but I mean, I could not tell you. But between that and I had a kid's illustrated edition with illustrations that were still too spooky for me.
Oh my God.
Yeah, they were intense illustrations. If I can find this somewhere in my parents' house, I will put them on. I was going to say Instagram, but we don't have one of those. Not yet.
Oh, no, we don't have anything. But I want to see them if they're scary.
Yes.
That's so funny, though. Like, the fact that there are children's adaptations of this is hysterical. I kind of forget how, like, I don't want to say sanitized, but it's such an interesting exercise to kind of go back to the source material where you have all of these like very goofy cartoony versions of Dracula. There are definitely Dracula episodes of Scooby-Doo, right?
Oh yeah.
I think that's probably my other main one is I used to watch a lot of Scooby-Doo and like Hanna-Barbera stuff at like 5 o'clock in the morning when I was a child.
Yes.
So that's probably the other big one as a kid where I was introduced to the character and the concept.
He's in 2 features, or 2 different features in 1988 in Scooby-Doo. Not that I know this at the top of my head for any reason. That'd be insane.
Oh my God.
He's both in Scooby-Doo and the Ghoul School, which I've already promised we would do an episode on later down the line.
Oh yeah, that's on the list.
And then also, he's also in The Reluctant Werewolf, which is an absolute fever dream of a movie. It involves goat kart racing heavily in its plot.
What?
Yeah.
That's wild. I'm trying to think, like, there's definitely like a lot of like kids adaptations, particularly in the early 90s. I feel like I'll have to kind of like look up some of them, but definitely sometime probably a little bit older than you explained, because like I wasn't super scared, but I was definitely also not watching the Christopher Lee version of Dracula, which everybody knows is the like overtly sexy Dracula. Um, so yeah, if I was going to be scared shitless, I don't think it was from Scooby Doo. But there are some actually scary episodes of Scooby Doo, but this wasn't one of them.
No, absolutely not.
um, but anyway, for our opening episode, like we've kind of alluded to, we thought it would be pertinent to revisit the source material because it would not really make sense to have a podcast about adaptations without talking about what the fuck we're adapting. So the general meat of this is going to line up with how we're going to do episodes in the future, meaning we'll talk about the history of whatever we're looking at. Usually it's going to be movies, really quick plot summary, some of the themes, the reception by the public, and then our takes. And like once we're watching films, we'll do a lot of time kind of giving our personal reviews and comparing them to the source and all that. But for this episode, it's mostly just kind of looking at the actual novel itself and our history of it, with it, rather. So speaking of that, what is your history with the actual novel Dracula?
My actual experience with the novel, and we're talking about the actual text, is probably dates back to college. I had read, I think, a couple comic adaptations growing up, but I didn't actually read the full text of the book until I took a gothic horror class in my senior year of college and really spent a lot of time diving into it and really appreciating the book for what it is. This read that we did for the podcast is probably the third one I've done. I also did an audiobook read of it last Halloween or so. And so I've really been enmeshed in this book, I guess, in the last 12 months, I guess.
That's awesome. That explains a lot as to your general mood senior year, is that you were taking gothic horror classes and just like slowly losing your sanity over the course of a 4-month period.
I also got compared to almost every villain in a gothic horror novel.
Oh my god.
Listeners, I am a very swarthy man. And if you look at any of these novels, they're always described as being wild-eyed, swarthy foreigners. So, yeah, that, was fun at first. It sort of gets to you after a while.
Gets a little bit old.
When we were doing Frankenstein, we were told to draw, not the famous version that everyone knows, but to just draw our own version of what we think Frankenstein looks like. And no joke, the kid sitting across from me just drew a portrait of me. A very good portrait.
God. He really clocked you for being Frankenstein. That's like, I would be both a little bit offended and also like a little honored.
Yeah, it was, frankly, I wish I still had that drawing.
That's hilarious. Well, my history with the actual novel Dracula, I will try my best to sum this up, but when I was in 7th grade, and mind you, I skipped a grade, so in 7th grade, I was, I believe, 11 years old. I grew up in a really small rural area of upstate New York, so my class, like the entire class, was at this point probably 9 or 10 people, like all of the 7th graders in the entire school, 9 or 10 of us. And we had a really great teacher who unfortunately passed away during that school year, but we were lucky enough to have her for a couple of months. She was a close friend of my dad's, and she was awesome. Her name was Mrs. A. Fucking shout outs to Ms. A. And she had us do a table read of a adaptation of Dracula for middle schoolers. So it was like maybe 20, 30 pages long. And we all sat in a circle, like with our scripts, and read it. I actually think it was in some kind of like kids magazine from like the early 2000s. Not highlights, but like something highlights adjacent. And yeah, we did this. And because I was one of the better readers, middle school flex, I was Mina. And I was absolutely just like completely engrossed by the story. I was like, this is the coolest shit I have ever seen in my entire fucking life. So after that class, I went to the library immediately and found the nastiest paperback copy of this book I could find and proceeded to try to read this for probably the next year. I think I gave up on it a couple of times, but by the time I was like 12 or 13, I had definitely read it in full and was like, that was the most boring horseshit I have ever read, and I have no idea how they got from point A to point B to this like super dope play that I got to do with Ms. A. Yeah, I was just obviously way too young to be reading a novel written in 1897. So again, like in college, probably around the same time you did, I was home on a summer break, and I think the summer before our senior year, I was like really depressed. I had gotten a job that didn't wind up working out. So I was home a little too much, and I found the same paperback because I never fucking returned it. So I found that like in my childhood room and was like, holy shit. So I revisited it then. So this was also my third time reading it. But I did an audiobook this time. And I did the Audible exclusive audiobook, which has Alan Cumming as Seward and Tim Curry as Van Helsing, which was absolutely delicious casting. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. What did you think of it when you first read it? And like, yeah, like what did you think of it when you first read it?
When I first read it, not counting the time I tried, again, also, like when I also tried to read in middle school and gave up because I realized that Van Helsing in this wasn't like the Hugh Jackman Van Helsing movie that had just come out. When I actually read the full book when I was in college, I'm gonna be honest, it didn't hit me nearly as hard as I thought it would. I wasn't as engrossed, and part of that is we had done a real gauntlet of 19th century Gothic classics, so this was coming towards the end of that semester. I had a lot on my plate. Early in the semester, some other ones that we revisited some other heavy hitters that I've read a bunch of times and love, like Frankenstein. We've done a few just truly wild, very early examples of the Gothic, Castle of Otranto and things like that. So by the time I got to Dracula at the end of that class, I was so overwhelmed that I don't think I fully absorbed it in the way that I did in these last two reads.
Yeah, I can fully see you being like, okay, look, I've been reading this shit for months now, and I'm gonna need a break from the bleak, okay?
Yeah, you can only take so much at one time, it turns out.
Yeah, Jesus Christ. So what did you think of it on this most recent read, then?
Every time I revisit this book, I like it just a little bit more. I think there are still sections that, to me, certainly have not aged as gracefully as they might have. They either drag a bit too long or there is some questionable content, but I find it more and more gripping every time I read it.
I am totally in the same boat. Like, again, middle school me, who like somehow managed to read this entire book, was like, I don't know what the fuck is happening here. And then in college, it's I honestly can't remember much of what I thought about it at that time. I think I was just extremely depressed. So I was like, anything is better than this. But this most recent go through, and like, I'm not an audiobook person, but this was really cool. I really enjoyed it. It kind of went back to like my initial introduction to the entire story, which was a table read. And that was fucking awesome. And I agree with you. There are some sections that are like way too long, but it's kind of a thing that happens with Gothic literature. But for anyone who, for some reason, if you're listening to this podcast and you're not familiar with the source material, kind of give a super quick history and recap. Dracula is a Gothic novel that was written throughout the 1890s and published in 1897 by Bram Stoker. It's an epistolary novel, which means it is kind of related through letters and newspaper articles and telegrams. So I think part of what winds up being hard for people is that it is not written like a contemporary or even many classic novels. It's not, there's no omniscient narrator. Everything is written either in first person after the fact. Like, you don't see the action happening, you hear people talk about it, right? And that winds up, I think, kind of being a little off-putting for people. It's definitely what confused me the most as a young teenager, was like, why is so much of this just like a very long diary? But anyway, it tells the story. There's no single protagonist. There's kind of three main sections of the book. You have solicitor Jonathan Harker taking a business trip to the castle of Count Dracula in Transylvania. And then you have the section in England where the Count moves there and kind of winds up doing his nefarious deeds. And then in the end, you have kind of the section that is back in Romania, and some of which is also in England, is the action sequence, which is saved pretty much for the end, but it can kind of be broken into those three distinct sections. And then I would say, in terms of what people are most aware of, they probably know the first two sections the best, particularly the diary entries of Jonathan Harker. When the novel is adapted, Harker usually winds up being one of our protagonists, along with Van Helsing, who is actually not in the book a ton. He's an important character, but he doesn't speak often and is kind of just talked about by other characters, and winds up being somebody who is obviously important in the end and has become an iconic character in pop culture. But it's kind of a tricky novel to pin down, both in terms of structure and characters.
It is. It's also, there are a lot more characters in the book than there typically are in the film versions. If you've only gone based off of a lot of the film adaptations of Dracula, you might be surprised to find that there is an American cowboy just kind of hanging out throughout the duration of the book.
Literally, yes. My fucking man. I feel like the clearest representation of you in a novel, not Frankenstein, Quincy Morris is you.
Yes. I can only hope.
But yeah, there's a lot more characters. So we'll kind of go through the characters really quick, just for the sake of those listening. As mentioned, we have Jonathan Harker, who is a young solicitor, which is kind of the old-timey equivalent of a real estate agent, who is summoned to our titular Count's castle in Transylvania. Obviously, Count Dracula is the antagonist, and who we're going to spend 90% of this podcast talking about. You have Jonathan's fiance and later wife, Mina Harker, who winds up being a kind of deuteragonist, and in terms of the female characters, is perhaps the lead. And then we have Lucy Westrena, who is Mina's best friend, who is one of the early victims of Dracula. You want to go through our our hearty trio, who are often condensed into one man, Will?
Yes. We also have our plucky trio who does a lot of the investigation into Dracula. We have Dr. John Seward, who runs an asylum that borders upon Dracula's abbey that he buys in England. We also have Arthur Holmwood, who later becomes Lord Godalming, who is basically a rich playboy man about town who is engaged to Lucy. And then we have the man himself, Van Helsing. Again, not a dour man in black leather, as a certain 2004 movie would lead me to believe.
Which is, like, too bad. Honestly, I'm always for more leather.
Yes. Is in fact a kindly old Dutchman.
Ja.
And a physician with a surprising knowledge of the supernatural.
And then, as mentioned, our man Quincy Morris, who is an American cowboy.
I feel like there could be more to say about him, but that's pretty much his his defining characteristics is that he is from Texas and that he does cowboy stuff. That is really what we're given, and that's enough, frankly.
Yeah, that's kind of all we need. And then you also have Renfield, who once this movie with Nick Cage comes out, we're gonna go see it. Renfield is one of Seward's patients in the insane asylum who has a strange connection to Dracula, which, of course, everybody exploits. And that is it kind of for our main characters. Again, this takes place in a couple different places, but if you know anything about it, you probably know the initial section, which is in Dracula's castle, where we psychologically torment Jonathan Harker. In terms of the history of the novel, this was written, again, over the course of almost the entire decade of the 1890s. Stoker did an enormous amount of research into Romanian and Eastern European folklore and allegedly took like hundreds of pages of notes about this, which is kind of fascinating, which is also kind of cool to think about, like how many of those notes wound up directly translated into the way that he actually put the novel together. But there were a couple of early iterations of this, but none of them have really seen the light of day. Upon its release, the reception was interesting. I was kind of expecting that like everybody would have hated this and it was only proven popular later, but it seemed to have actually done pretty well when it was published. It, like you said, was kind of at the height of the Gothic period. And most of the critics who read it remarked on the use of horror and atmosphere. I did see a couple of funny notes that said some of the work's detractors claimed it was too frightening.
That's what I found, is that when the book was released, a lot of the contemporary reviewers liked the book quite a lot, but not a lot of them saw it as being much more than just a fun, thrilling potboiler. A lot of them didn't see any resonance with the culture at the time or in any themes. I have a review from the Athenaeum that I'm quoting for. Dracula is highly sensational, but it is wanting in the constructive art as well as in the higher literary sense.
Interesting. Yeah, kind of a pulp situation, which is so funny considering that it's one of the most adapted works of all time. Like, obviously it's in the public domain, but even that's really interesting. I didn't think that people would be like, yeah, this is pulp, but like people like it. I don't know. Like, what was it, the equivalent of like Twilight? You know what I mean? Like people reading Twilight being like, yeah, I guess it's entertaining, but I don't know if it's good.
I would say it's something like Twilight, or even just, I would say it's a lot like modern superhero movies where people say, it's a fun thrill ride, but there is really not much going on behind the engine of this. It's not a thing of substance.
I love that so much. That's a really great comparison. Which is funny that you say like there's not a lot of substance, because there is an enormous amount of academia on Dracula, even in the niche ways. In terms of themes, like there's not a lot that we can say that hasn't been said and thought about and written about for decades and decades and decades, particularly involving gender, sexuality, and race. There is a cottage industry of academic articles on this, I am sure to this day, but in particular in the last century. What stood out to you this go round thematically?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because what stuck out to me on this read in particular is that this movie is, one, both horny as shit, and two,
oh my god, yes,
just gay as shit.
This shit's so gay, Will. And like, I know a lot of people are like, you can't ascribe X sexuality to X work of art, but like, wow, the bromance in Dracula, particularly, like, there are so many men in this, and they are all just like, you know what? Let's work together for the good of the country and the women and also each other. I cannot describe how gay this shit is.
The book is roughly half, if I had to just do an estimate, just men professing their love and allegiance to each other over the course of the
Yes.
novel, while women are sort of dutifully wasting around in the background. They're making solemn pacts with each other.
Solemn pacts. That is a great way to phrase it. And it's so funny, like there's obviously that aspect of sexuality involving like homoeroticism, but also you have to consider when this came out, which was the Victorian era, and like there has been plenty said and written regarding sexuality in general in the Victorian era, and wowee, can you see that in this piece? There is a whole lot about virginity. There's a whole lot about penetration. There's a whole lot about women's sexuality. Wow. Lucy, who is kind of our secondary female character, who is one of Dracula's victims and kind of the first victim you see directly. It's fascinating to me that like she winds up coming back to life as a vampire and is super sexy and hot and seductive, and is also the woman who 40 pages prior received 3 marriage proposals on the same day. Like you can't really dislocate those two from each other.
Oh god, no. No, it's even before she is painted as a fallen woman in death, she is painted throughout the novel as being, in comparison particularly with Mina, as being the, I guess, the looser of the two of them, the one who is being courted by multiple men and just simply cannot decide which of them to marry.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, wow. And then Mina, on the other hand, is reserved. She is married to Jonathan. She falls into the hands of Dracula, but escapes using, her chasteness and the help of several men. But is also, interestingly, portrayed as very intelligent. And this go around for me, what stood out a lot was the treatment of Mina in the text. I think she's a really, really interesting character. Her knowing shorthand is what allows her to communicate essentially in code with Jonathan. She's one of the people who can type on a typewriter. And she's just like really fucking organized, man. I believe she's a teacher. And, my wife is a teacher, or is a PhD student who, teaches classes. And while I was listening to this, I was like, you though. Like she has a way of writing and speaking that is like so clearly reminiscent of somebody who spends a lot of time teaching things to other people. And I think that I expected, obviously there are very dumb gendered things in this, but I expected it to be worse than it was. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I think Mina is particularly fascinating because she is at once this example of traditional English virtue, but she's also, in many ways, a modern woman. She is associated with technologies that had just emerged in the last decade or so. She can type. She is fascinated by the wax cylinders that Seward records on and uses those to do her journals later on in the book. She is self-sufficient in a way that Lucy is never depicted as being. So she is, I think, a character that gets put down quite a lot, but has much more going on with her than one would initially assume.
Right, exactly. And that's kind of what stuck out to me in terms of this go round. So as you said, this is very horny and very gay. The horny, it cannot be overstated. There are some sections of this that I sent to you that I was like, I'm genuinely warm. I am alarmed. I am alarmed by how horny this is. And I think that young me thought we were going to get a lot more horny that I could understand, but I think I had to be 30 in order to get this kind of like very flowery prose horny. But
yes.
Holy shit.
Oh, yeah. Early in the book, Jonathan describing his journeys into the castle and his interactions with the brides of Dracula are You sort of need to cool yourself down after some of those.
You really do. And that's one of the
intense.
other. It's intense, and that's one of the other scenes that is talked about a lot in terms of Victorian views of sexuality, because it's reversed through this whole book. You see all of this, like Dracula is this like masculine presence who is like essentially raping your women. In this scene with Jonathan, there are 3 women who are both seducing and attempting to bite him, and that is extremely subversive for the time. And I feel like were we to make a like porn parody of this in 2022, it would straight up be pegging. Like that's what we're that's what we're working with here.
We're getting that, and then Jonathan snatched from their clutches by Dracula, with him declaring that this one is his.
Yes. Oh my God. Literally, he's like, no, he's mine.
Which is, I think I did some research into this, and I think the wording of that section was actually different between the British edition and the American edition released 2 years later. That scene was put back into the American edition because, by Stoker's reasoning, well, America has Walt Whitman. They're all about this kind of thing.
Exactly. And then like the forward that you said in like a version that you read, like an annotated version, they were like, yeah, Stoker was great pals with Oscar Wilde. And that kind of tells you what you need to know. But that is absolutely wild.
Oh, absolutely wild.
Hey, I did not even catch that. Wow. Thank you. But in terms of like, again, I was surprised at how well they treated Mina, but there are a couple of like really funny sexist bits, where one of them just says, "She has a man's brain." I was like, wow. I love that so much for so many reasons. Quote, laughing and crying at once like a woman may, so I scolded him as one might do to a woman under the circumstances, which I think is Seward to Jonathan. Like, stop crying, you little bitch. So good. And also like weird stuff involving marriage and monogamy. Like there's a lot of exchanging of fluids. There's a lot of blood transfusions, and all of the men, particularly Quincy, Seward, and Van Helsing, are very insistent that they not tell Arthur Holmwood that they gave Lucy blood, because that would be extremely scandalous, obviously.
I think I sent you some messages about that scene.
Yes. That I have a note here. So like, I think as we wind up doing this podcast, we'll have a couple of fun segments, where we kind of, one of them, which we'll be picking a note of the others to read. So like out of context, my will note for this episode would be, and I quote, blood cucking Lord Godalming.
Listen,
which is
I'm not
my
proud
favorite.
of it. But
You should be. You should be proud of it. It's great. I guess kind of speaking of segments, like I said, this is a little bit of a setup episode and a bit of a roadmap for how we're going to do things in the future. We have a couple of ideas of what we think would be fun. Most importantly, though, is a grand ranking of all of the Draculas, because he is the title character for a reason. If you are doing an adaptation and you don't have a good Dracula, you are fucked.
I think that's so true. I think a movie is going to live or die by its Dracula. There's some
exactly
that I think have all the elements around it that really come together, and then Dracula at the center of it is not great. I think the reverse of that is you have a movie like, I'd say, Todd Browning's Dracula of Bela Lugosi, that is iconic for his performance, his mesmerizing performance. It is truly lightning in a bottle, particularly at an era where so many movies are dinged for being stagey in that Hays Code era, or excuse me, that was pre-Hays Code, but with a lot of those early sound pictures, there's a lot of staginess, the camera doesn't move very much, so they're very static, and in spite of that, his Dracula really stands out, but I would say that the movie around him is not nearly as good as his performance, but because he is so hypnotic in that role, he's always at the top of the heap.
Right, exactly. So I think we're going to try to have some sort of spreadsheet situation that has a grand ranking of every Dracula, not the film, but like the character. And I feel like that's kind of a little bit of the heart of what we're trying to get to. I also have a note here that says rate the overall vibe of each or assign points to values such as, and I quote, very horny, weirdly not sexy, or too rapey. Because we're going to get a grab bag of all three of those, and some that are like really boring, which is too bad. We'll be able to see, like you said, you're going to live or die by your Drac casting.
With that in mind, I mean, we don't have a point of comparison, but how are we feeling about our OG Dracula here? What is your take on our guy at the center of this novel?
This kind of goes back to thematic stuff. But as you said, you noticed this shit was really horny this go around. I noticed this shit was really fucking anti-Semitic this go around. Wowie zowie. You can basically read Dracula, the original novel, as invasion literature, right? It is about a foreigner coming to England who is a monster who cannot die, etc., etc. This Drac is awesome for a lot of reasons. He is obviously the original Dracula, but there's something about the way he's written by Stoker that is such a delicious combination of monstrous and like very masculine and genuinely scary, but that kind of affable, polished evil that we're used to seeing in kind of media after this. Like, Drac knows what he's doing. He's extremely wealthy, extremely well researched. Harker talks a lot about like, wow, he knows so much about England. What a model immigrant, that he loves our country. Holy shit. Yeah, wowie. This Dracula, description-wise, physically, has been remarked upon for a very long time as being blatantly anti-Semitic. As you said, a lot of descriptions of this era really talk about swarthy men with, suspiciously hooked noses. Wow. Yeah, you have any thoughts on that particular train of thought?
I think you're spot on. I think a lot of critics today will go back and forth on it, but I think when you're framing where this novel is coming from, and part of the reason that so many of the contemporary critics are looking at it as being just one thrilling potboiler amongst many, is that it's treading in that similar kind of... It is treading in similar water. It is one book in a series about threats to the Empire from...
Yes.
Be it Darkest Africa or from Eastern Europe or anywhere else on the continent. So much of the escapist literature of this era is dealing a lot of those... what they're deeming to be wild elements that they see as being a threat or a challenge to the British Empire and to the morals of the British people.
Right. And like reading this piece with that in mind is like as clear as day. It is literally invasion literature. And what I like about going back to read this is like, I think a lot of people have the urge to be like, no, XYZ is problematic, so you shouldn't read it. And I'm like, no, dude, like you absolutely should read it for that reason. People talk about H.P. Lovecraft all the time being like a crazy, horrible racist. Correct. He was a crazy, horrible racist and was not even just quote of his time. He was worse than his time.
Oh, truly just a malignant racist incel dork, but one who's very important.
One who's very important, and I think if you read, it gives you a way of seeing how the mindset and the prejudices of an author influence their writing. And if you don't take the time to read these things, that have been influenced by the political climate of the time or by the author themselves, then you can't really spot it. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like it teaches you media literacy, particularly in line with history. So, like, with Lovecraft's work, you know, if you were just reading Shadow over Innsmouth and you didn't know about his history, you'd be like, yeah, that was a wild story about fish people. But if you read it, you're like, oh my god, this is about miscegenation. This is about, quote, race mixing. Like, the author will always inform the piece, and the climate in which it was written will come out whether you want it to or not. So that's why I like reading this kind of thing, because you can be like, holy shit, like, this does make sense as something where in that time period it would be a threat to the empire. So yeah, that's kind of that front. I guess we went back to themes there for a little bit, but the character of Dracula himself is the clearest representation of that. There's also a lot of really wretched shit about Romani people and nomads and Eastern Europe in general, but the Count as an embodiment of a character, as an anti-Semitic caricature, and a literal monster, and the villain of the piece for 1,000 different reasons is really clear in this piece. What are your other thoughts on this, on the OG Drac himself?
What's fascinating to me about this original version of Dracula is that you see a lot of elements that get molded and shaped into the various versions that pop up throughout culture in the intervening century. But you see a lot of elements that, for the most part, are kind of left on the cutting room floor, I guess. You get a lot of the sensuality, you get a lot of the ruggedness, particularly between Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee later on down the line, but you also, a lot of those miss a lot of Dracula's pride and his sense of lineage. Dracula sees himself as being the last of a dead kind. He sees himself as being the last of a lineage that no longer exists and that is crumbling away between them. So what I find fascinating is you don't see a lot of quite that same kind of history and lineage in a lot of adaptations. You get a bit of that and with the Francis Ford Coppola one down the line, which, boy, I'm going to look forward to talking about that one.
Woohoo!
But Dracula is never placed quite within his personal history. Also, he casually puts out there that he went to a school called the Scholomance that was taught by the devil as a dragon, and that the devil just takes one of the students at the end of the school. And frankly, that seems like a detail that we need to circle back around to.
Right, like, come on. I want to see, you know what I want to see? I want to see a fucking Mike Mignola Hellboy, like, short story that is just that.
Oh my god, yeah.
Like, why have we not gotten this? Why have we not gotten more of this? But yeah, I'm interested. Something that we'll do a lot as we go along is kind of comparing the differences between whatever adaptation we're watching and the original. And a lot of that is going to come down to Drac himself, the characters involved, and which parts of the plot are cut or embellished upon. So kind of moving forward, just to talk a little bit about what we plan to do, we will be looking at straight adaptations of the story, so one that is the story of Dracula and not just taking the character of Dracula out of context. So, like, yeah, we will probably get to the Scooby-Doo one, but not until we watch kind of the most famous screen adaptations first. And slowly but surely we will get more insane to go with what is kind of public domain fan fiction, if you will.
Yeah, I think there is so much out there with Dracula on the sidelines. There's so much stuff that is that features the basic outline of Dracula with different characters. For example, I think something like Salem's Lot, which is probably my favorite Stephen King book, it takes the same basic plot but puts it in 70s Maine. But I think having just the core story, seeing how this book and the plot beats have been rearranged, have been edited, and in some cases adapted whole cloth, I think would be really fascinating going forward for at least this first leg of the podcast.
Absolutely. I'm really excited about that. In terms of like what we are going to be doing next, what are you looking forward to? Like, are there any pieces that you're like really fucking hyped for that are on our list?
Well, I've already mentioned it, so I might be tipping my cards, but I have some obsession with the Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1994.
Oh,
I
God,
find
yes.
that a visually stunning, baffling mess of a movie. I don't know if I would go as far as to say it's, even objectively a good movie, but it swings for the fences. It's got so much going for it. It's got an absolutely phenomenal cast, and I cannot help but just constantly rewatch that movie.
Has some photos of Winona Ryder that are not saved on any of my devices for any reasons at all.
No, not at all. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, in terms of ones that I'm really looking forward to revisiting, that's definitely up there. I've actually never seen the 1958 Hammer Dracula with Christopher Lee. The Francis Ford Coppola one is 92. There is also one which we will be watching, likely with my beautiful wife, who I love, which is an adaptation of Nosferatu with Klaus Kinski. And that's going to be a fucking weird one that I'm very intrigued by.
That is... I've seen it once, and it is a trip. I cannot wait to revisit it again.
I am thrilled.
I mean, with that in mind, I think is our first one up on the deck the original Nosferatu from the
Yes,
20s?
it is. Yep, 1922, OG Nosferatu. That's going to be such a great way to kind of kick this off because it's so iconic, but I feel like most people haven't seen it. So I'm really excited to do that. And yeah, we've got like a good chunk for our first leg here. In terms of things that you are dreading, is there anything that is on our list where you're like, God, I know this is going to be a pain in the ass?
Looking at our list here, I don't know if there are any that I am particularly dreading. I think they're probably gonna... Frankly, I'm going into all of them with an open mind. The ones that I've seen, for the most part, I've enjoyed or at least gotten something interesting out of. And I'm sure there'll be some that are a little bumpier rides than others, but I'm willing to kind of take them as they are.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, in terms of like, once we get to like less straight adaptations, there are two that I have seen enough of where I'm like, God, I'm going to have to make myself sit through this. One of which is Dracula 2000 with Gerard Butler, directed by Wes Craven. I know that's going to be a fucking disaster.
I mean, I love my boy Wes, but...
Whew. And then there's a 2013 TV series starring Jonathan Rhys Meyers, which I actually watched as it aired. And I don't think I finished it for a lot of reasons. And I'm sure I will rediscover those reasons once we get that far in our little journey here. How do you think this is going to go? Like, what are your predictions, man?
God, what are my predictions for this podcast? I don't know. I think we're going to find a lot of these adaptations are a lot wilder than we take credit than we're expecting them to be.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to see them depart from the source novel in probably some pretty wild ways.
I am totally in line with you there. Yeah, I think that I'm going to really enjoy watching some of the older films because I'm less familiar with them. And just as a note, we do have a list of non-English language films that we'll be kind of sneaking in when we can as well. And I have seen none of those, except for El Santo versus the Vampire Women. Obviously, I've seen that because we all love El Santo in this house, even though that is not an adaptation by any means. It is on the list because, God damn it, if we have a chance to watch El Santo, we're going to do it. But yeah, I haven't seen anything else that is a non-English language film or a foreign film. So I'm really excited about this. I think that based on this kind of opening episode, we are going to have plenty to talk about, but I have really enjoyed kind of just reviewing this with you.
Oh, likewise. It's been a pleasure.
Yay! So next episode, We will be again opening with the 1922 film Nosferatu. Again, extremely iconic, not often actually viewed. And we will be back with that as soon as I get this fucking edited, man.
I feel like we're gonna have to come up with a closing tagline or something.
Yeah, maybe at the beginning you can say Dracula A, and then we can wait like an hour, and then you can say to Dracula Z, and nobody will remember it. I think that'll be a really good bit.
That would be great. People will definitely tune in long enough to get there.
100%. I'm also like desperately looking for little audio clips I can bookend this with. So if you have any suggestions, please send them to me. Thank you.